There's an exact moment when almost every person who nearly got rich quietly decided to stop. Not the day everything fell apart. The day right before it would have worked, and they never found out how close they actually were. I used to think quitting came from weakness. I don't think that anymore. The people who walk away right before the breakthrough aren't lazy, and they're not cowards. They're obeying a rule buried so deep in how the mind protects itself that most of them never notice they're following it at all. You've done this. Maybe once. Maybe on something you can still name if I gave you 30 seconds. In the next few minutes, you're going to find out exactly what that rule is, and the one distinction Napoleon Hill spent his life documenting. The thing that separates people who quit inches from everything they wanted from the ones who kept going. If you've made it this far, it's because you're determined to have a life of success. So I invite you to subscribe to the channel, because every video will help you develop the mindset that attracts wealth, prosperity, and new opportunities every day. Let me tell you what quitting actually looks like, because it's almost never what you picture. You probably imagine a dramatic moment, a door slammed, a resignation shouted, some clear line crossed where a person announces, even just to themselves, that they're done. That's not how it happens. Not once, in anything I've studied about the people who walked away from something that would have worked. It happens in a much smaller room than that. A tired exhale, a quiet decision made at 11 at night, that tomorrow you'll focus on something more realistic. No slammed door, just a slow loosening of the grip, so gradual that most people never noticed their hand had opened at all until they look back years later and realize they're not holding anything anymore. Here's the part that should unsettle you, and I mean that honestly, not as a hook to keep you watching. The moment persistence actually breaks isn't usually the hardest moment of the struggle. It's often a fairly ordinary one, a slow week, a small rejection, a bill arriving at an inconvenient time, that happens to land on a mind that was already running low on something it needed and never noticed it was missing. The struggle didn't defeat you. The absence of something specific did, and most people never find out what that something was, because they were taught to believe persistence is just a personality trait. You either have grit or you don't. Some people are simply built tougher. I want to take that belief apart in front of you, because it's wrong, and it's done more damage to more unfinished dreams than almost any other idea people carry about themselves without question. Napoleon Hill spent years studying people who built extraordinary things and people who came agonizingly close and stopped, and he arrived at a conclusion that still surprises people the first time they hear it stated plainly. Persistence, in his findings, was never a fixed trait some people were born with and others weren't. He described it as a state of mind that could be deliberately developed, built out of specific, identifiable ingredients. The way a house is built from lumber and nails rather than simply willed into standing by someone's stubbornness. Which means the man who quit and the man who kept going weren't necessarily different in temperament. They were often missing or carrying entirely different raw materials. Sit with that for a second, because it changes the entire question. If persistence were only a matter of toughness, there'd be nothing useful to say to you right now except try harder, which is advice so empty it barely counts as advice at all. But if persistence is built from specific parts, the way Hill spent decades documenting, then the real question isn't whether you're tough enough. It's which part is missing from what you're carrying right now, today, on whatever it is you've been quietly circling for longer than you'd like to admit. I think about a woman I came across while researching this, who spent nearly 3 years building a small catalog business almost entirely alone, working nights after a full day at a job that had nothing to do with what she actually wanted. She told me the year she almost quit wasn't the hardest year financially. It was the year she stopped being able to picture, with any clarity, what she was actually building toward. The desire was still technically there, she said. It had just gone soft around the edges, like a photograph left out in the sun too long, and once it lost its shape, every ordinary setback that came along after that started to feel like proof she should stop. That's not weakness. I want to be precise about that, because the word weakness gets thrown around carelessly, and it's usually wrong. What happened to her had a specific name, a specific mechanism, and this matters more than anything else I'll tell you in this video. A specific way of being repaired before it costs you something you can't easily get back. There's a reason I keep circling back to that word, repair, instead of the word discipline, which is the word you've probably heard attached to every conversation about persistence you've ever sat through. Discipline is what people reach for after the fact, once the picture has already gone soft, trying to force a feeling back into place through sheer effort. It rarely works for long, and I think you already know that from experience, even if you've never said it out loud. What actually works is further upstream, in a place almost nobody looks, because it isn't dramatic and it doesn't photograph well for a highlight reel. Before I show you what that place is, I need you to see something else first. Something about the specific fears sitting underneath almost every quiet, undramatic quitting moment I've ever come across, including, if you're honest with yourself, a few of your own. Here's the fear, and I think you'll recognize it the moment I name it, even though almost nobody says it out loud in plain language. It's the fear of being watched failing, not failure itself. Most people can survive failure that happens quietly, on their own terms, where no one else has to know the details. What actually breaks persistence, more often than exhaustion, more often than a lack of money, is the fear of what it will look like to the people around you if this doesn't work. Your brother-in-law's face at Thanksgiving. The coworker who raised an eyebrow when you mentioned it. The version of your own mother's voice in your head, gentle but doubtful, asking if you've really thought this through. Napoleon Hill identified this directly as one of 6 basic fears working against the average person, and he called it the fear of criticism. He was specific about where it usually comes from, not some deep philosophical wound, but ordinary childhood habits, the small corrections and comparisons most of us absorbed so early we stopped noticing they'd become instructions. Don't stand out too much. Don't embarrass the family. Don't get your hopes up in front of people, because if it doesn't work, you'll have to explain that too. By adulthood, that early training doesn't announce itself as fear anymore. It just feels like good judgment, quietly filtering which ideas ever make it out of your head and into the world where someone could actually watch you try. I sat with a man in his 50s who'd carried a specific business idea for almost 15 years without ever seriously starting it. Not because the idea was bad. When he finally described it to me in detail, it was clean, obvious, the kind of thing that made me wonder why nobody in his town was already doing it. When I asked what had actually stopped him, he didn't talk about money or time. He talked about a dinner, decades earlier, where he'd mentioned a much smaller version of the same idea to his father, and his father had laughed. Not cruelly, just the quick, dismissive laugh of a practical man hearing something he considered impractical. That laugh lasted maybe 2 seconds. He'd been organizing major decisions around avoiding a repeat of it for 15 years. I want you to notice something about that story, because it's the part that should genuinely surprise you. He wasn't afraid of losing money. He'd run the numbers more than once over those 15 years, and the risk, financially, was manageable. What he was actually protecting was an image of himself in other people's eyes, an image that had never once been tested, because he'd never let the idea far enough into the world for anyone to actually judge it. He was defending a reputation for good judgment that no one had ever threatened except the version of his father living rent-free in his own head, still laughing at a dinner table that no longer existed anywhere except inside him. This is where persistence actually dies most often, and it's almost never in the dramatic collapse people picture. It dies in the small, private negotiation where a person decides, quietly, that avoiding possible embarrassment is worth more than the thing they said they wanted. Researchers who study social stress have a name for what happens in your body during moments like that dinner. A spike triggered specifically by the sense of being evaluated by others, sharper and more physically real than almost any other kind of stress response we know how to measure. Your nervous system doesn't file public judgment as a minor inconvenience. It files it closer to a threat, which is exactly why one 2-second laugh can outlast 15 years of otherwise sound thinking. Here's what makes this fear so much harder to catch than ordinary self-doubt. Self-doubt sounds like a question: can I actually do this? The fear of criticism doesn't ask questions. It answers them for you, quietly, in advance, by simply steering you away from anything that might invite a verdict from someone else before you've even had the chance to try. You don't experience it as fear. You experience it as timing. Not now. Not yet. Maybe when things are more certain. Maybe next year. I think about how many ideas have died exactly that way. Not rejected, not attempted and failed, just quietly starved of oxygen by a person protecting themselves from a room that was never actually watching as closely as they imagined. And I think about what it would take to build something strong enough to survive that room anyway, because that's exactly where we're headed next. The people who survive that room aren't the ones who stopped caring what others think. I want to be honest with you about that, because it's a nicer story than the real one, and the real one is more useful. Almost nobody who builds something lasting reaches a point where criticism simply stops registering. What changes instead is something quieter and far more specific. The purpose sitting underneath the fear becomes so definite, so exact, that the fear no longer has enough room left to make the final decision. Hill was precise about this, more precise than the shorter, quoted version of his ideas usually gives him credit for. He didn't describe persistence as raw toughness holding a line against doubt. He described it as something built, piece by piece, starting with a purpose specific enough that you could describe it in a single sentence without hedging, backed by a desire strong enough that the purpose stopped feeling optional. Most people never get past the first requirement. They want more money, a better life, something different, true, but too vague to survive contact with a single skeptical dinner conversation. A vague want folds the moment someone raises an eyebrow, because there was never anything solid enough underneath it to hold its shape against pressure. A definite purpose doesn't ask permission to exist. It's already decided, before the criticism ever arrives, exactly what it's for. I want to go back to the woman with the catalog business, because there's a detail I left out earlier that matters more now than it did before. The year her persistence nearly broke wasn't only the year her desire went soft. It was also the year her purpose had drifted from something specific, a defined product line, a defined customer, a number she was working toward, into something vaguer, something closer to make this work somehow, which sounds similar but isn't. Vague purposes don't just fail to inspire you. They fail to protect you, because there's nothing precise enough inside them to push back against a doubtful relative or a slow moth. She told me the turning point wasn't a burst of renewed motivation. It was an afternoon spent rewriting exactly what she was building, in specific enough language that she could say it out loud to her own family without flinching, because for the first time in months, she actually believed the sentence herself. There's a concept in modern behavioral science that sits almost perfectly next to this. Researchers who study how people actually follow through on intentions have found that vague goals, the kind most people carry around, unexamined, predict follow-through poorly, while specific, clearly defined intentions predict it dramatically better, almost as if the mind needs a precise enough target before it's willing to defend that target against resistance. It isn't about motivation levels at all. It's about definiteness. A blurry purpose gives your own fear something soft to push against and win. A sharp one gives it almost nothing to grip. This is the part one think you need to sit with honestly for a moment, more than anything else in this video so far. If your own persistence has been quietly failing you, on the business, the relationship, the body, the version of your life you keep almost building and then setting back down, I'd ask you to consider whether the real problem was ever your discipline at all, or whether the purpose underneath it had gone soft and vague sometime along the way, without your noticing exactly when. I'm going to show you in a few minutes. The exact story Hill returned to again and again to illustrate what happens when a purpose stays definite through the worst possible stretch of doubt. A story about his own life, not someone else's, that most people who quote him have never actually heard in full. Before I get there, I want to ask something of you directly, because I think it matters more than it might sound like it does right now. If any part of what I've described tonight is true for you, if there's a purpose in you that's gone a little soft, a little vague, a little too easy to abandon under pressure, I want you to write "I believe" in the comments right now. Not as a slogan, as a specific, definite statement made in front of other people about a purpose you're choosing to sharpen instead of quietly letting drift. I read every one of them, and the version of you who writes that today, in public, on purpose, is already harder to talk out of this than the version who scrolls past it in silence. While you're typing that word, let me tell you about the third piece, because it's the one that trips up people who've actually gotten the first two right. You can have a sharp, specific purpose. You can want it badly enough to feel it behind your ribs some mornings before you've even opened your eyes. And you can still watch it fall apart, because wanting something specific isn't the same as having a specific way of getting it. Hill was careful about this distinction, and I think it's the one most people skip past fastest, because having a plan sounds so much less exciting than having a dream. A plan doesn't photograph well. Nobody gets goosebumps from a spreadsheet. But a purpose without an organized plan behind it is a wish wearing the costume of a decision. And the moment resistance shows up, a wish has nothing solid to stand on. I think about a man I spoke with who wanted, more than almost anything I'd encountered, to leave a factory job he'd held for 11 years and build something of his own. His desire wasn't the problem. He could talk about the life he wanted for close to an hour without repeating himself once, in specific, vivid detail. What he didn't have, when I asked him directly, was any actual sequence of steps between this Tuesday and that life. No defined first move, no timeline, no answer for what he'd do differently starting tomorrow morning versus what he'd been doing for 11 years already. His purpose was definite. His plan was fog. And fog, I've noticed, is exactly where persistence goes to quietly starve, because there's nothing concrete enough inside it to take a single actual step toward. Here's what happened to him instead, and I think you'll recognize the shape of it even if the details differ from your own life. Without a plan, every ounce of that real, burning desire had nowhere to go except back into more wanting. More nights imagining the life. More mornings feeling the ache of not having it yet, with no outlet in between except the ache itself. Desire without a plan doesn't disappear. It curdles. It turns from fuel into a kind of low-grade grief you carry around, present in every quiet moment, doing nothing but reminding you of a gap you have no defined way of closing. This is where Hill's framework gets genuinely practical instead of merely inspiring, and it's worth sitting with directly. He didn't ask people to simply want harder. He asked them to build an organized, definite plan, and this part gets left out constantly, to move on that plan immediately, even imperfectly, rather than waiting for a version of the plan that felt fully ready. He'd watched enough failed dreams to notice a pattern. The plan people wait to perfect before beginning is very often the plan they never begin at all, because perfecting is a task with no natural finish line, and it's remarkably good at disguising delay as diligence. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters more than any single piece of advice I could hand you. None of this, not the sharp purpose, not the organized plan, not even genuine desire, guarantees anything. Hill never claimed it did, and I won't pretend to you that it does either. What all three actually guarantee is something smaller and, I'd argue, more important. They guarantee that when the hardest stretch arrives, and it always arrives, for absolutely everyone who's ever built something worth having, you'll have something solid enough to hold on to besides raw willpower alone, which runs out faster than almost anyone expects. There's a version of this test that Hill himself lived through, not as an observer writing about other people's persistence from a comfortable distance, but as the person standing in the middle of it, for longer than most people would tolerate, with almost everything telling him to stop. I've referenced his research more times in this video than I can count. I haven't told you yet what it actually cost him to finish it, or how many years he spent doing something that, from the outside, looked very much like it was never going to work. I think it's time I did. In 1908, a young journalist walked into a room to interview one of the wealthiest men alive, expecting to leave with a magazine article. He left with an assignment that would consume the next 2 decades of his life. Andrew Carnegie had built one of the largest fortunes in American history, and Napoleon Hill had come to ask him the kind of questions journalists ask successful men: how he did it, what he'd learned, what advice he'd give. Carnegie answered, but then he did something the young reporter hadn't expected. He proposed a different assignment entirely. He believed the principles behind success weren't scattered luck, unrepeatable and personal to each man who found it. He believed they were consistent, identifiable, and teachable. If someone was willing to spend years extracting them directly from the most successful people in the country, one interview at a time. He offered to open doors Hill could never have opened alone. Letters of introduction to men like Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, and dozens of others building the industrial backbone of the era. What he didn't offer was money. Hill would fund the work himself, for as long as it took, with no guarantee it would ever amount to anything at all. He gave the young man only a moment to decide, right there in the room, with no time to go home and think it over, no chance to run the numbers first. Hill said yes. I want you to sit with what saying yes actually meant, because the shorthand version of this story skips past the part that matters most. It didn't mean 2 comfortable decades of interesting conversations with wealthy men. It meant roughly 20 years of self-funded work, supporting himself however he could between interviews, while the actual payoff stayed entirely theoretical the entire time. There was no publisher waiting, no advance, no guarantee at any point along the way that the philosophy he was assembling would ever become a finished, sellable, useful thing rather than a very long, very expensive personal obsession. He faced business failures during those years. He faced stretches of real financial hardship. He faced, more than once, the kind of doubt from people close to him that we've already talked about tonight. The raised eyebrow, the quiet suggestion that maybe it was time to find steadier work, the sense that he was chasing something that had already cost him more than it could reasonably return. Here's what I think most people miss about this story, including plenty of people who've read his books cover to cover without ever hearing this part. Hill didn't have any special evidence, partway through those 20 years, that it was going to work out. There was no moment where the fog cleared and the outcome became visible in advance. What he had was a purpose defined precisely enough, that day in Carnegie's office, that it survived every single one of the ordinary, undramatic quitting moments we've spent this whole video describing. The slow week, the small rejection, the bill arriving at an inconvenient time. He'd made one decision, in one room, in far less time than it's taken you to watch this video. And then he simply kept the decision made, year after year, long after the excitement of making it had worn off completely. This is the part he later described as the sustained effort necessary to induce faith. Not a feeling that shows up first and makes the persistence easy, but a discipline practiced without the feeling for as long as it takes, until the evidence finally arrives to justify what you already decided to believe. Faith, in his account, wasn't the starting condition. It was the result. You don't get to feel certain before you begin. You get to act as though you're certain, for years if necessary, and the certainty catches up eventually, or it doesn't. But either way, you were never entitled to it in advance. 20 years after that meeting, the philosophy was finished. What came out of it eventually reached more people than either man in that room could have imagined. And it started with a yes that had absolutely nothing solid underneath it except a decision one person made and refused to quietly unmake. One ordinary day after another, for longer than most people would consider reasonable. I don't think the lesson here is really about the length of it, though 20 years is a real, sobering number worth sitting with. I think the lesson is smaller and harder to escape than that. He didn't know, at any single point along the way, exactly how far away the finished thing actually was. He just never let a bad week be the one that got to decide. Here's what that story leaves out if you only take the inspiring version of it. A single decision, made once in a single room, doesn't carry a person 20 years on its own. Decisions fade. The feeling of conviction that comes with making one is real, but it's also temporary. And if persistence depended on recapturing that exact feeling every single morning for 2 decades, almost nobody would ever finish anything at all. What actually carried that decision forward wasn't the memory of the room. It was what the decision turned into once the room was long behind him. A habit, repeated so often it stopped requiring the original burst of conviction to keep going. This is the piece Hill placed last in his framework, almost as an afterthought in how briefly people summarize it, even though I think it might be the most practical piece of all. Purpose gives you a direction. A plan gives you a path. But habit is the part that actually walks the path on the days you don't feel like walking anywhere. And it's built the same way every habit is built. Not through a single dramatic act of willpower, but through repetition specific and small enough that it eventually stops asking your permission. There's real science behind why this works, and it isn't mystical. Every time you repeat a specific action, your brain reinforces the neural pathway underneath it, coating it, in a sense, with material that makes the signal travel faster and more efficiently the next time. The technical process has a name, but you don't need the name to understand the result you've already felt yourself. The first time you drove a new route to somewhere unfamiliar, it took your full attention. After the 20th time, you can drive it while your mind is somewhere else entirely, because the effort required has quietly dropped almost to nothing. Persistence works on exactly the same mechanism. The version of you doing the hard thing for the first time needs enormous willpower. The version doing it for the 200th time barely needs any, because the action has stopped being a decision and started being closer to instinct. I think about the man from the factory again, the one whose desire outran his plan for years before he finally built something concrete to follow. Once he had that plan, small, specific, an actual first move rather than a fog of good intentions, the thing that made it stick wasn't a fresh surge of motivation every morning. He told me the change was almost boring to describe. He picked 1 hour, the same hour, 5 mornings a week, before the rest of the house woke up, and he protected it the way you'd protect an appointment with someone you respected too much to cancel on. The first 2 weeks were miserable. He told me honestly that most mornings he didn't want to get up, and some mornings he barely produced anything worth keeping once he did. But by the 3rd month, something had shifted that he couldn't fully explain. The hour had stopped feeling like a fight. It had become, in his words, just what he did now. The way brushing his teeth was just what he did now, requiring roughly the same amount of internal negotiation, which is to say almost none. That's the part almost nobody tells you when they talk about people who persisted for years at something difficult. It rarely stayed difficult in the same way the whole time. The difficulty was front-loaded, concentrated most heavily in exactly the stretch where the habit hadn't formed yet, and every single repetition still required the full weight of a decision. Get through that stretch, and the terrain changes underneath you, quietly, without announcing itself. What used to cost you enormous effort starts costing you almost nothing, and what replaces the effort is something closer to identity. Not a person forcing themselves to do a hard thing, but a person who simply does that thing now, the same way they describe any other unremarkable fact about themselves. I want to be honest with you about something before we go further, because I think it's the question sitting underneath everything I've told you so far, and it deserves a direct answer instead of another inspiring story to dodge around it. Here's the question, stated plainly, because you deserve the plain version rather than something softened to keep you comfortable. How do you actually tell the difference between persistence and simply being too stubborn to admit something isn't working? because from the outside, in the moment, they can look identical. The man who finally quits a bad idea after 5 hard years and the man who quits a good idea after 5 hard years are doing the exact same thing on a Tuesday afternoon. Only one of them is right, and neither of them gets to know for certain which one they are until much later. I'm not going to pretend that isn't a real risk, because it is, and anyone selling you the idea that persistence always pays off eventually is selling you something simpler and less honest than the truth. Hill himself was careful about this distinction, more careful than the shorter version of his message usually gets credit for. He never described persistence as refusing to change anything, ever, under any circumstance. What he described was refusing to abandon the underlying purpose while staying genuinely open about the method, because the method was never the point. The purpose was the point. A person who keeps hammering the exact same failed approach for years, refusing new information out of pure pride, isn't practicing persistence in any sense Hill actually meant. They're practicing something closer to stubbornness, wearing persistence as a disguise, and the two are not the same, even though they can feel identical from the inside on a hard day. He tied real persistence to something specific, accurate knowledge, gathered honestly, rather than hope substituting for information, which gives you an actual, usable test, not just a comforting phrase. Ask yourself, honestly, whether what's making you want to quit right now is new information, a fact you didn't have before, a genuine signal that the approach itself is flawed, or whether it's simply fatigue, rejection, or a bad week borrowing the voice of wisdom to talk you out of something a calmer version of you already decided was worth doing. Those two things produce the exact same tired feeling in your chest. Only one of them should actually be allowed to change your course. There's a well-documented pattern in behavioral economics that circles this same territory from a different direction. The tendency to keep pouring effort into something specifically because you've already invested so much into it, rather than because the investment still makes sense going forward. That pattern is real, and it does trap people. But it's worth noticing that it isn't actually the opposite of persistence. It's a different failure altogether, one where past cost is doing the deciding instead of either present information or original purpose. The antidote isn't quitting more easily. It's asking the same honest question every time doubt shows up. Has anything actually changed about whether this purpose is worth pursuing, or has only my energy for pursuing it changed today? I think about the woman with the catalog business one more time, because she eventually faced this exact fork herself a few years after the stretch we already talked about. A supplier she'd relied on for 2 years quietly went out of business, and for a moment, it felt like confirmation that the whole thing had been a mistake from the start. She told me she sat with that feeling deliberately, on purpose, for a full week before deciding anything, specifically because she'd learned by then not to trust a decision made in the first raw hour of a setback. At the end of that week, she asked herself the honest question: had anything changed about whether people still wanted what she was building? No. Only her supply chain had changed, which was a logistics problem, not a verdict on the purpose itself. She found a new supplier within a month. The business is still hers. That's the difference, as close as I can put it into words. Real persistence isn't blind. It's informed, and it's honest, and it's willing to change absolutely everything about the method while refusing to change its mind about the purpose underneath it, which is a much harder, much more demanding thing to practice than simply refusing to ever quit anything. And it's also the only version of persistence that's ever actually worth building. I haven't told you where any of this actually comes from, and I think it's time I did, because it would be strange to talk to you this honestly about persistence without admitting how close I came to failing at it myself. This channel wasn't the first thing I tried to build. It was the third, and I mentioned that not for sympathy, but because the first two are exactly the kind of thing we've spent this whole video discussing. Both of them died in that quiet, undramatic way. Not a dramatic collapse, just a slow loosening of the grip, a series of ordinary weeks where I let a small setback do more deciding than it should have been allowed to do. I told myself both times that I was being realistic. Looking back now, with everything I've since learned about how this actually works, I can see I was simply protecting myself from a room that was barely watching. The same way the man with the 15-year business idea protected himself from a father who'd forgotten the dinner before Hill ever came into my life at all. There was a specific night, about 8 months into building this one, where I came close to making it 3 for 3. Nothing dramatic had happened that week. That's actually what made it worse, in a strange way. There was no single clear disaster I could point to and justify stopping over. Just a slow accumulation of ordinary discouragement, a week where the numbers didn't move the way I wanted, a comment from someone close to me that wasn't even unkind, just doubtful, the gentle kind of doubt that somehow lands harder than open criticism ever does. I remember sitting at my kitchen table well past midnight, the rest of the house dark, genuinely negotiating with myself about whether this was the year I'd admit it wasn't going to work. I didn't have some perfect line from Hill waiting in my head that fixed everything in that moment, and I won't pretend I did, because that would be exactly the kind of dishonest, tidy ending I've been trying not to give you tonight. What I actually did was smaller than that. I asked myself the same question I described to you a few minutes ago, the one about the woman and her supplier. Had anything real actually changed about whether this purpose was worth pursuing? Or had only my energy for pursuing it changed on one particular exhausting Tuesday, the way energy always dips eventually, for everyone, regardless of whether the underlying thing is actually working? Nothing had changed. The purpose was the same purpose I'd defined, specifically, months earlier, on a calmer day, before the exhaustion had a vote. What had changed was one difficult week borrowing the voice of certainty to tell me something it had no actual authority to tell me. I want to be honest that recognizing this didn't make the discouragement disappear. It didn't. What it did was smaller, and it turned out to be enough. It gave me somewhere to put my hands while the discouragement was still sitting in the room with me. A decision already made, a purpose already defined, a habit already 3/4 built by that point, carrying weight on its own even on the nights I had almost nothing left to give it. I kept going, without any of the certainty I wish I could hand you right now as proof that this always works out. I can't hand you that. Some of the people I've described to you tonight didn't get the ending they were working toward, and I won't insult you by pretending everyone who persists gets rewarded for it eventually. What I can tell you, from the other side of that particular midnight, is that the version of me who almost closed the laptop that night was operating on exactly the same faulty math as every person in this video who quit 3 feet, or 3 months, or 3 years too early, mistaking a feeling for a fact, and nearly letting the feeling make a decision it was never actually qualified to make. Here's where all of this stops being a story about other people and starts being something you can actually use tonight, before whatever brought you to this video has a chance to fade the way most insight does by morning. Start with the purpose itself. Take whatever it is you've been quietly circling, the business, the change, the version of your life you keep almost building, and write it down as one specific sentence, not a paragraph, not a mood, one sentence, precise enough that a stranger could understand exactly what you mean without you explaining further. If you can't do that yet, that's not a failure. That's information. It tells you the purpose is still too vague to survive the first real test it meets. And vague purposes are exactly what we've spent this whole video watching collapse under ordinary pressure. Sharpen it until it holds its shape out loud, in front of another person, without you needing to soften it or apologize for it. Once that sentence exists, give it one concrete next action. Not the whole plan, not every step between here and the finished thing, just the very next move, small enough that you could actually do it this week without waiting for a better moment. The factory worker didn't need a 5-year roadmap before he started. He needed 1 hour, 5 mornings a week, and a decision about which hour. Fog kills more purposes than difficulty ever does, because fog gives you nothing concrete enough to actually begin. Then look honestly at who's been standing in the room while you talk about this. Not to cut anyone out of your life. I'm not telling you to do that, and I don't think it's usually necessary. Just notice which conversations leave you smaller and more hesitant than you were before you had them, and which ones leave you sharper. Protect the plan while it's still young enough to be talked out of existing by a well-meaning raised eyebrow. You can tell the people who love you what you're building once there's something solid enough to survive their questions. You don't owe anyone access to it while it's still fragile. The next time doubt shows up, and it will, probably sooner than you'd like, run the test before you let it make any decisions on your behalf. Ask yourself honestly whether something has actually changed about whether the purpose is worth pursuing, or whether only your energy has dipped today, the way energy dips for absolutely everyone, regardless of whether the thing they're building is working. New information earns the right to change your course. A hard week doesn't. Unless you let it borrow authority it was never given. And then, finally, repeat the small action until it stops requiring the full weight of a decision every single time. The first 2 weeks will be the hardest ones you'll face in the entire process. Not because the work itself gets easier later, but because the decision to begin it each day gets easier, the way any repeated action does, until it's simply what you do now rather than a fight you have to win every morning before breakfast. None of this will feel dramatic while you're doing it. And I think that's exactly the point most people miss, waiting for a feeling of certainty that was never going to arrive before the action did. Every version of persistence we've talked about tonight, Hills, the woman with the catalog business, the man from the factory floor, my own kitchen table at midnight, looked, from the inside, almost identical to simply doing an ordinary, unremarkable thing one more time. It only starts looking extraordinary from a distance, years later, once someone else is standing where you're standing now, asking how you actually did it. I told you about the man who carried a business idea for 15 years, frozen by a 2-second laugh at a dinner table that no longer existed anywhere except inside his own head. I never told you what happened after we talked, because I wanted you to sit with the weight of those 15 years first, without the resolution softening it too early. I think you're ready for the rest of it now. He didn't start the business the week we spoke. I want to be honest about that, because a tidy ending where everything changes overnight would be exactly the kind of story I've been trying not to tell you tonight. What actually happened was smaller and slower, and I think that's what makes it worth telling. A few months after our conversation, he sat down and wrote his purpose as one sentence, the way I described to you a few minutes ago, not the vague version he'd been carrying around for over a decade, but something specific enough that he could say it out loud without flinching. Then he did something that took him longer than the sentence had, which was decide on one small, concrete first move, and give it an actual date rather than a someday. He told me the date he chose wasn't dramatic. It was a Tuesday, 3 weeks out, nothing symbolic about it, just the next reasonable window in his calendar. What mattered wasn't the date itself. It was that a date existed at all, for the first time in 15 years, turning a wish he'd been protecting from the world into a plan the world could actually see coming. He told his father 2 days before that Tuesday, not because he needed permission, but because he'd decided the idea was finally solid enough to survive being looked at. His father didn't laugh this time. He asked a few skeptical questions, the kind any reasonable person might ask, and for the first time in 15 years, the son had real answers instead of a fragile hope he was afraid to expose to scrutiny. That's the part one think matters most in this entire story. The fear had never really been about his father's opinion. It had been about the emptiness underneath his own idea, dressed up as a fear of judgment, so he wouldn't have to look directly at how undeveloped the plan actually was. Once the plan had real weight to it, the criticism he'd spent 15 years avoiding turned out to be almost nothing at all. The business he eventually built wasn't the version he'd originally imagined at 22. The grand version that had probably been part of what kept it frozen for so long. Genuinely good ideas can die waiting to become perfect ones. It was smaller, more specific, built around exactly the first concrete move he'd committed to on that ordinary Tuesday. And it grew from there the way most real things grow, one deliberate step at a time rather than one dramatic leap. He told me, almost as an aside, that the version he'd imagined at 22 probably wouldn't have worked anyway. It had been built entirely out of desire, with no plan underneath it strong enough to hold real weight. The version he actually built was smaller, sturdier, and his. I think about the 15 years more than I think about the business itself, honestly. 15 years is a long time to let a 2-second sound outlive its own moment, replaying in someone's head with a power the original moment never actually had. He didn't get those 15 years back. Nobody gets that kind of time back, and I won't pretend the story is tidier than that. What he got instead was the rest of his life, built on a purpose finally sharp enough, and a plan finally solid enough to survive a room that, it turned out, had barely been paying attention the whole time. At the start of this video, I told you there was an exact moment when almost every person who nearly got rich quietly decided to stop, and that you'd probably done this yourself, on something you could still name if I gave you 30 seconds. I didn't tell you then what that moment actually looks like from the inside. I think you know now, because we've walked through it enough times tonight that you'd recognize it the next time it comes for you. It never announces itself as quitting. It shows up dressed as realism, as timing, as a reasonable adjustment to circumstances that were never actually as final as they felt in that particular hour. A purpose that's still too vague to say out loud without hedging. A room full of people whose opinions were never actually as fixed on you as your own fear insisted they were. A plan left in fog because fog felt safer than the first concrete, judgeable step. A habit never given the repetitions it needed to stop requiring willpower. And underneath all four, the oldest trick of all, a bad week, dressed up as wisdom, asking to be allowed to make a decision it was never actually qualified to make. You have all of it now. Not as a checklist to complete by Friday, because I don't think that's what any of this was ever for. What I've actually been describing to you all along is smaller than 4 separate lessons and harder than any of them individually. It's the willingness to decide, once, in a moment that might last less time than it took you to watch this video, and then defend that decision against every ordinary, undramatic pressure that will spend years afterward trying to quietly talk you out of it. Andrew Carnegie's office is long gone. Nobody alive remembers the exact words exchanged in that room, and it doesn't matter that they don't, because what mattered was never the words. It was the 20 years that followed a single yes, carried forward not by ongoing inspiration, but by a purpose specific enough to survive its own absence on the days inspiration failed to show up at all. Somewhere in that same city, at roughly the same time, other men were making the safer decision, the more reasonable one, the one nobody would have blamed them for making. Their names didn't make it into this video, or into much of anything else. That isn't a cruel detail. It's simply what happens when a decision gets handed to a bad week instead of kept by the person who made it. You're not behind. Whatever you've been quietly circling, however many years, however many false starts, however many 2-second sounds you've let outlive their own moment inside your own head, none of it means you lack what the people in this video had. Every single one of them started exactly where you're starting, in an ordinary hour, with no evidence yet that any of it would work. I don't know what your version of that hour looks like. I only know that you're in it right now, whether you came to this video already knowing that or not. The purpose is either specific enough to survive tonight, or it isn't yet. The plan either has a first move with a date attached, or it's still fog. The room you've been protecting yourself from was probably never watching as closely as you feared. And somewhere close by, there's a small, unremarkable action, waiting to be repeated until it stops asking your permission. Whatever you decide in the next few minutes, after this video ends and the screen goes dark, will very likely matter more than almost anything I've said to get you here. If this reached something true in you tonight, follow the channel before you go. There's more of this waiting for the next time you're standing in your own version of that room. And if you know 5 people quietly circling a decision they've been putting off, send this to them. You might be the reason one of them finally writes the date down.